Hi, it's Tracy from KATZ Quilting in Rimbey, Alberta, Canada, and we are just winding up the Tula Pink Free Spirit Homemade Collection Trunk Show. So we were so lucky to have the quilts, the 12 finalist quilts, spend 2 weeks in our shop, in our learning center. We are in a semi-lockdown situation in Alberta, Canada, where we had a limited capacity, 10%. So we've worked really hard to try and get people into our shop on an appointment basis, limited group numbers, but there were so many people that were disappointed that they couldn't come. So we are just going to do a quick rundown on the quilts for you, just show you a few highlights and things that we thought were amazing. They were all wonderful. We are so lucky. Thank you so much to everybody who came to visit us and everybody that helped make this happen. So first of all, Mr. KATZ is doing the video. We are from the same household, which is why I'm not wearing my mask right now. So he's going to do the video for us today. The first quilt is called Made with Love by Jackie Smith. And Jackie is from Bend, Oregon, and she submitted her quilt into the Stitch and Post Quilt Shop, which is the host of the Sisters Oregon, the outdoor quilt show every July in Oregon. So I'm just going to read every one of the quilt had an artist statement, so I'll just give you a brief rundown of this. She said, I show my friends and family I love them by making them homemade gifts. For this quilt, I used a technique where I designed the quilt in Photoshop and then printed it out actual size. Next, she cut the images apart and traced the pieces on fabric and sewed them together. So this is not foundation paper pieced. She's made a pattern piece and she's cut it out on fabric and she's made a pattern piece and she's sewed them together. She sewed them into the background. She's pieced all of this quilt. I just love her use of color and her detail. So our next quilt is called The Spirals of Life by Erin Reef. Erin is from Stratford, Iowa, and her home shop is Mended Hearts. The quilting is done by Erin Reef, and the quilter is Angela Worth. Erin says that she loves quilt work quilts and the complexity of how they look. She used Quilt Stir to help her aid in her color layout. This quilt is made with foundation paper piecing and 100% from the homemade fabric line. She also gives credit to Aurifil thread, and an interesting detail about her quilt is that she's used different weights of thread to emphasize the quilting. So she's used a lighter weight thread on the outside. She's got this hot pink, a heavier weight thread that brings the color into the middle of the quilt. Her quilting details here are just fabulous. The next quilt that we have is called House Cat by Julie Schum, and Julie is from New Hamburg, Ontario, and her home shop is Quilting by Design, so this is a Canadian entry. She called it House Cat. She said she chose this quilt because of the challenge piecing circular quilts. I also wanted a quilt that would be a great candidate for custom quilting, and I'm very thankful for the beautiful job my sister Claudia did. So this is a sister team, piecing and quilting. House Cat probably came from the name that this was a pattern called Catnip using Tula Pink's Tabby Road a few years ago, and she's recolored it into the Tula Pink homemade line. So lots of details in the quilting, in the piecing, and she likes the challenge of a circular quilt. Our next quilt is another Canadian entry. This is Homemade Sandstone Spears by Julie Faulkner of New Westminster, BC. Her home shop is Petting Fabric. Julie said, my love of sewing comes from my grandmother who taught me to quilt over 40 years ago, and my mom who taught me to English paper piece by hand using scraps from the clothes she made. So the quilt is made from Tula Pink Homemade, and her stripe fabrics, she's used Aurifil thread for quilting and piecing. Our next quilt is called Inspired by Tammy Wilcox. Tammy is from Shenango Forks, New York, and her entering shop, her home shop, is Missouri Star Quilt Company. This is pieced by Tammy and also quilted by Tammy. I made this with inspiration to create. I created the pattern using different resources. First, she started building her quilt plan in EQ8, that's Electric Quilt 8, which is a computer program to design your quilts in. She used piecing, applique, scan and cut, Aurifil thread for the satin stitch, Tula pink ribbon, embroidery from the Tula pink homemade collection, which was available on the Tula pink Berninas. She also used sewing and embroidery periodic table by Anita Good Design, and that's what you're seeing on the outside of the quilt. She has put the design in white here, and then she's also embroidered the whole background of that block in a coordinating thread, so it gives texture and interest. Lots of work in each of those blocks. She's used the embroidery design here. She's added embellishment with Tula pink ribbon. She's got applique on there with satin stitch. She's created the most beautiful little block here with a bunch of words. Lots of details in this one. The next quilt that we have is My Creative Time at Home by Daniela M. Daniela comes from Paola, Iowa, and her home shop is at Iowa Quilt Block. I'll just read her artist statement here. You are looking at me designing a quilt in my imaginary home, surrounded by my favorite things: books, spools, birds, flowers, flying geese. She has a beautiful EPP quilt here with 1/4-inch hexes that it looks like she has pieced by hand, quilted by hand, and added them with edge-turned applique to the background of the quilt. Amazing detail in this quilt. I love how she's used the mirror image of the fabric here in these birds. Her piecing here with her fussy cutting on her flowers is just impeccable. She's got lots of details embroidered into here. She's used a hand embroidery around the edge of the quilt, and it tells the story. She's got Slovakia on there, and I think maybe that was at one time part of her life. If you back and give the whole of the quilt. She's got button embellishments on there. She's got a bookcase with all sorts of little books in there. There's lots of stories going on in that beautiful quilt. Our next quilt is one of the biggest quilts in the collection. This is called When Novas Collide by Jody Murphy. Jody is from Olympia, Washington, and her home shop is the Quilt Barn. This is pieced and quilted by Jody Murphy. After making Tula Nova quilt, she pondered 3 Novas colliding. Playing with geometry and color placement, new patterns emerged. She used Aurifil thread for piecing and quilting. Very interesting to note, she free motion quilted this with love on her Tula pink Bernina 770, which she calls Bonnie. So this huge quilt has been free motion quilted on her domestic machine. So she has impeccable fussy cutting here on her English paper piecing. Just amazing how she's matched the designs. I love how she's used the dark background and then the white to set everything on. Another thing that I've noticed in the last couple days, every day that we come here, we see something new about these beautiful quilts. I love on her border, she's echoed her quilting out to the edge a little bit, left a bit of space there, and then added her round designs, and that actually changes the color of that border even though it's the same fabric. It's an interesting technique and I just love it. She's put so much work into this. It's really, really pretty. We're just going to move over. We had 4 local entries from our shop and we were lucky enough to have them hanging here. So I would just like to introduce you to them. Wendy Hilldale from Drayton Valley did this beautiful quilt. This is a quilt as you go technique that she learned from Jenny Doan, Missouri Star Quilt Company. It's a beautiful soft look and it gives that beautiful scalloped edge without having to put binding on. So that's a beautiful, beautiful quilt. We thank Wendy for allowing us to have it hanging here this week. Another quilt that we have here is Kim Glavin from Three Hills, and she chose to put her Tula Pink Homemade in the Meadowland quilt pattern by Then Came June. She chose this, I think, because there's big blocks and it really shows off that beautiful homemade fabric. This quilt has been custom quilted by Love Shack Quilts out of Airdrie, Alberta by Jason Blackmore, and he chose to put little sewing machines in all the blocks. And he has this beautiful custom pattern on here that creates lots of movement in this quilt. Another quilt that we were lucky enough to have is Piece by Piece from Sheila Vanderlinden from Edmonton, Alberta. This is an original design. She designed all of this quilt herself, and she's also a professional long arm quilter, so she's quilted the entire quilt. She has these beautiful crazy square blocks. It's a traditional piecing technique where you add embellishments. Sometimes you would put sequins, ribbons, lace. She chose to add some embroidery stitches off of her machine on all of these beautiful blocks here with beautiful thread and different stitches. So you'll see that in all the blocks. She also designed a block using a technique so kind of wonderful, the crazy curve ruler or quick curve ruler. She designed this block to have like a cathedral window style look to it. She's custom quilted each one of the blocks inside. She also designed a log cabin block featuring all of the beautiful Tula pink Bernina machines. She did this beautiful heart block here. She has the flying geese running along the edge with this individual flange that's left open all along the border. The next quilt that we have from our local entry is called Love in the Stars by Betty Stretch from Calgary. Betty chose to make a sampler quilt. She loves stars and hearts, so that's how she started putting it together. She's done some fabulous fussy cutting up here in the top and the star. She featured the Tula pink Berninas in her big star, and she's got lots of hearts and stars, X's and O's, and the word love in the middle. So she really wanted to make her quilt lend towards that Tula pink homemade, what we all love about sewing and making. The next quilt in the 12 finalists is called Home is Where My Sewing Machine Is by Janine Wells. The quilter is also Janine Wells. She's from Youngsville, North Carolina. Her home shop is Carey Quilting Company. Janine says that she's been quilting for 6 years. Her daughter learned to quilt, so she learned to quilt in order to have some time with her daughter, which is a really cool idea. This is an original design. She had used these blocks before in previous projects and combined some blocks that she really loved to make this original design. What's really interesting about this quilt is she has quilted this whole quilt, this entire quilt, on her embroidery machine, block by block. So we've got some feature embroidery things. She's got some measuring tapes here. She's got some scissors down in the corner. The whole quilt is quilted block by block through her embroidery machine. So that is really interesting. I love it. So the next quilt that we have is Measure Twice, Cut Once, which is the golden rule in quilting, correct? And it also was a name of one of the fabrics that Tula Pink had with all of her rotary cutters and cutting utensils on it, so it's a great play on words. It's by Lacey Poirier, and she's from Libby, Montana. It's quilted by Sherilyn Mortensen. The home shop was Hummingbird Lane Fabrics. 7 years ago at 25, she was diagnosed with lupus, which is an autoimmune disorder. She realized that her major trigger for a flare-up was sun exposure. So her mother and her got together and decided that maybe she needed a hobby inside. So they decided that quilting would be a really good thing for her. Her mother bought her a Bernina. The rest is history. She fell in love with discovering quilt patterns, putting together fabric choices and colors, watching projects come to life. She watched video tutorials, explored internet sites, and found Instagram for inspiration. I love all of her beautiful, it's like a kaleidoscope of color, a waterfall of color. It's a kaleidoscope moving across the page. She's got this edge turn applique where she's put these scissors on. She's just kind of dropped them off to the side. What I love about this picture is this looks like the floor of our sewing room after we've cut the edges off of our half square triangles. So it's really beautiful. This quilt is called 2020 So Chaotic by Summer Rather. She is from Orange, Texas, and her home shop is Thimbleful of Stars. She's got a great story here. 2020 So Chaotic explains this year. So all of these quilts were made last year in the heat of COVID in North America. The chaos has been a real hurricane of issues, but when I sew, all those issues melt away. I look at this quilt and I see that I turned the chaos into happiness, from the eye of the storm to the outer bands. She used English paper piecing to piece the top and a domestic sewing machine to free motion quilt the entire quilt. She used Tula pink homemade Orifil thread from start to finish, and it almost seems like a personal challenge. She incorporated every color in the line. So every one of these blocks, these color changes, all has its own color of Orifil thread on it. Her quilting is just incredible. She's done this on her domestic sewing machine. She's added a lot of interest and texture here. Those little circles just pop out. One thing that I really like about this quilt is this isn't a sashing, it's a piece of fabric laid over, top stitched down. Again, she's changed the colors of her thread all along the way. It really makes a beautiful, beautiful border for her quilt. It really frames it very, very nicely. The next quilt that we have is called Celebrate Homemade by Lydia Cheney. She is from Morgan Hill, California, and her home shop is a Nimble Thimble. They were the kind shop that shipped this tour to us just now. This quilt has been quilted by Teresa Silva, who is a rock star quilter and actually wrote that book, Longmorn Quilting Workbook, that we have down there. So I thought that was kind of cool. So Lydia says, I can't say enough about Tula Pink's unique fabric collections, which are perfect for my obsession with English paper piecing and fussy cutting. This is an original design for this quilt. She used Tula Pink homemade fabric and many colors of Orifil thread. The techniques she used are English paper piecing, foundation paper piecing, needle turned applique. So again, her choices, her fabric cutting, amazing attention to detail. Look at these beautiful, beautiful things here. And then she's appliqued that onto the background. She's got some gorgeous combinations here. Beautiful. And then she's got this double flying geese border that frames the quilt. So lots of beautiful details and interest and blocks in here. Again, fussy cutting, just amazing. Our next quilt is called Validation by Tanya Brubaker. Tanya entered her quilt on her own. She's from Mustang, Oklahoma. She said, I wanted to create something that really spoke to all creators, and I love peacocks. As soon as I got her fabric and she saw the rotary cutters, she knew that that was going to be the eye of the peacock feather. Peacocks symbolize vision, self-expression, spirituality. I chose the title Validation because I believe as artists, we get validation from what we create. This looks like an art quilt to me. It looks like a little bit of a collage process. She's done some beautiful thread painting to add some texture and draw all the colors together in this quilt. There's a lot of interesting details. She has this beautiful little hummingbird in here that people spotted. So again, I just want to say thank you to Tula Pink, of course, because you make this all possible. You keep us inspired and creating. Thank you to Free Spirit Fabrics for all you've done to help us get this show here. Thank you to everybody who came. Thank you to everybody who's at home and that supports our quilt shop. Thank you so much. Have a great day.